Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. The University of Minnesota Spotlight Series is a collaborative partnership between the Institute for Advanced Study, the University Honors Program, and Northrop to present lectures, panel discussions, exhibits, and other events throughout the academic year around timely topics of interest. The six-part 2021 series is focusing on polarization and identities, inspired both by the recent presidential election and the polarization that has appeared in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In an environment in which conversations across different identities and ideologies are becoming increasingly contentious, we hope to model ways to create meaningful dialogue about these difficult but important topics for our students and our community. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on Dakota land, ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The IAS acknowledges this place has a complex and layered history. This land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and each other. The IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. It's my pleasure now to introduce today's panelists, Charles Westerberg and Tom McBride, who are professor and professor emeritus at Beloit College and co-authors of the Marist Mindset List. Created by Tom McBride with Ron Neef at Beloit College in 1998, the Mindset List was meant to reflect the worldview of entering first-year students and to help faculty understand incoming classes. The list started with the members of the class of 2002, born in 1980. In the 20 years since, the Mindset List has been a valuable marker of social, economic, and cultural change for successive generations as they have progressed through American institutions of higher education. If you have questions at any time during today's presentation for our two speakers, you can enter them in Zoom through the Q&A feature. That will typically be in the bottom Zoom menu bar if you are on a desktop computer, or in the top right if you are on a mobile device. You can also use the chat feature to either send comments to the panelists or to introduce yourselves to each other and have conversations with each other. And to do that, you want to select all panelists and attendees. Our moderator for today and for the series is John Rash, an editorial writer and columnist. His Rash Report column analyzes media and politics, and his focus on foreign policy has taken him on international reporting trips to China, Japan, South Korea, Rwanda, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Lithuania, Kuwait, and Canada. John's commentary can be heard on WCCO AM on Friday mornings at 8:10 a.m. and on Wednesdays on Playing Politics, a podcast from the editorial board. He lives in St. Louis Park with his wife, 2 children, and a dog. Thanks, John, and I will let you take it away.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and the introductions, and thanks to all of you joining us either here on campus or online. You know, much of what we'll discuss here and much of what most mull over when considering generational differences are the sharp splits between age cohorts. Thus, the title of today's talk, Will COVID-19 Turn the Generation Gap into a Chasm? But the scene on your screen and on the stage at least speaks in part of a coronavirus commonality that will mark or mar this point in time for all generations. Indeed, you just look at it. I'm on stage speaking through a mask, speaking to our guests virtually, and fielding questions from participants in the room or on Zoom. If this scene were set in a novel or on Netflix, it would immediately evoke 2020, and unfortunately, at least probably, part of 2021, until a vaccine is widely available, and most importantly, widely used by a majority of all generations. The only thing that might timestamp the era even more is if we talked about the presidential election, and so we'll do some of that this afternoon as well, including the sharp departure from the growing cohort of Generation Z and Millennial generation voters, who combined are now a more formidable force than even the baby boomers. Somehow, however, despite the younger voters and the generation that thinks it's forever young, the candidates set records as the oldest in U.S. history. So we can talk about that dynamic as well. You know, it's often been said, and the reason perhaps that cliches take hold and span the generations is because there's some truth to them, that demography is destiny. And among the most determinative demographic distinctions, of course, is age. But like all key categories, there's more of a mosaic than a monolith in attitudes and opinions and experiences in terms of age. So that and much more will be addressed and discussed today. But first, we want to hear from our two panelists, Tom McBride and Charles Westerberg. Their thoughts will surely trigger thoughts of our own, which we'll then explore in questions from me as well as from all of you, either online or, again, on campus here. So first up, we're going to start with Charles Westerberg. Charles, thank you very much for joining us today, and please, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, John. And thanks also to the University of Minnesota and the organizers of the Spotlight series for inviting us to talk with you today. As a sociologist and contributor to the Mindset List, I'm really excited to get the chance to talk with you about a form of polarization that I think is becoming more important in American life, the generation gap. Tom and I will be sharing conflicting perspectives on the generation gap with you today. I will lead off and suggest that I think the generation gap has grown and will continue to grow, made worse as a result of the difficult times we currently find ourselves in. On the other hand, Tom will suggest some ways that the generation gap might actually be a source of strength and a basis for shared knowledge and social cohesion as we confront increasingly existential questions and problems in the days and years ahead. To give you just a little background, the early 20th century sociologist Karl Mannheim defined generational consciousness like this, quote, "A group of people becoming mindful of their place in a distinct group, identifiable by their shared interests and values," unquote. He believed that social, economic, or political changes can bring attention and awareness to these shared interests and values for similarly aged people who experience these events together and thereby form a generational consciousness. These shared interests are at the heart of my argument today. I believe that we are seeing increasing generational consciousness, and I expect to see more. I want to suggest that what we call the generation gap is widening, and intergenerational conflict will become more common and salient in American politics. To make my argument, I will focus on three changes that I think are important structural drivers of generational consciousness. Number one, I will posit that the rectangularization of the population pyramid has set the conditions for increasing generational consciousness, the rectangularization of the population pyramid. Number two, I will argue that the increasing economic inequality exacerbates generational consciousness. So I will argue that increasing economic inequality exacerbates generational consciousness. And finally, number three, many millennials and members of Gen Z perceive that their voice is not represented in the halls of government due to the aging of the occupants in many key positions. Several commentators have gone so far as to suggest that we are no longer living in a democracy. Rather, we are living in a gerontocracy. We are living in a gerontocracy. As a result of these three interrelated factors, I argue that we should expect the generation gap to become less gap and more gulf. As we grapple with issues like COVID-19, climate change, and social justice more broadly, the generation gap will be exacerbated and grow in intensity. I predict that intergenerational conflict will become a key issue in future political discussions and elections. My overall argument rests on an important change in American demography that doesn't get the attention I think it deserves: the population pyramid. The population pyramid is a tool that's used to determine the overall age distribution in a population. The traditional basic idea is that when a society has a healthy birth rate, it will have a solid base to the pyramid. And as you move up the pyramid, the population will gradually shrink as people pass away for various reasons. If you look at the slide I have shared with you about the pyramid, you can see that the shape of the pyramid has changed significantly over the last 70 years. In 2020, it looks much less like a pyramid than it did in 1950, and it looks more like a rectangle. This is what scholars mean when they talk about the rectangularization of the population. In fact, the proportion of the US population that is 65 or over more than doubled from around 8 to over 17% between 1950 and today. Estimates suggest that the proportion of people over 65 will approach 25% by 2050. Of course, this change is directly related to the post-World War II baby boom. This is particularly significant if we consider government programs that were designed to assist people financially as they age. Two notable examples are Social Security and Medicare. The logic of these programs was based on the pyramid. That is, younger people who should be more numerous will pay into the programs from their salaries or their taxes over the course of their careers. When they reach retirement age, they will receive payments to assist them economically. I hope you see the problem. When the population rectangularizes, a much smaller proportion of people is paying into the kitty for Social Security and Medicare. This endangers the viability of the programs for younger people. It also introduces economic inequality between generations, and as a result, conflicting political incentives of the sort Mannheim was talking about. We are already seeing this phenomenon lead to the kind of inequality I'm talking about. Age-based wealth inequality has increased over time. From 1989 to 2016, the median net worth of families with a head of household age 65 or older increased by 68%. Over that same time period, the median net worth of families with a head of household age 35 or younger decreased by 25%. You can see this, of course, graphically on the slide that I've shared with you. It's important to remember that these measures of net worth do not capture the value of the government benefits I was just talking about. And as I alluded to just a moment ago, projected growth in federal spending over the next decade is concentrated in areas that benefit older families, such as Social Security and Medicare. At the same time, according to a recent report from the Brookings Institute, spending on younger families, such as investments in children, is projected to fall as a share of the federal budget. These two trends, in addition to a large projected growth in net interest payments, mean that younger families will not only have less wealth, but will be expected to pay for debt-financed federal spending that has mainly benefited prior generations. In my view, this does not bode well for generational consciousness or the generation gap. When we start thinking about inequality based on age, it's hard not to cast our attention to the fact that many commentators are characterizing our federal government as a gerontocracy. What the heck is a gerontocracy, you ask? Put simply, it is rule by elders. Why is the idea of a gerontocracy getting so much attention these days? Well, when you look at the leadership of the country, you'll notice that it is dominated by elders. For example, no matter who won the recent presidential election, that winner will be the oldest sitting president in American history. Joe Biden is 77 and Donald Trump is 74. If we turn to the Congress, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, is 80, and the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, is 78. To put it another way, while the average age of all members of Congress is 58, a number that has been consistently increasing since 1981, those legislators are 20 years older than their constituents on average. Why is this a problem? Many young people are questioning how this generation gap is impacting the emphasis leaders are placing on the issues that are most important to them. As we dig into climate change, COVID-19, and broader social justice issues, questions are arising about priorities and about the likelihood that the decision makers will have to bear the consequences of the decisions that they are making. Perhaps this is why the generationally conscious meme and retort, "Okay, boomer," has gained so much notoriety lately. I believe we should expect generational finger pointing and derision to increase in intensity. So to conclude my somewhat dour portion of our presentation, I want to reiterate that the rectangularization of the population is creating new inequalities in access to government support programs, and that it is also exacerbating pre-existing economic inequalities between the generations. Meanwhile, the political leadership of the country continues to get older, and the degree to which that leadership will prioritize issues that motivate younger citizens is more than an open question. Perhaps my colleague Tom McBride can improve all of our moods. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. And indeed, we're going to turn to Tom in just a moment, and he certainly may not only have a different perspective, but may want to weigh in on some of these questions. But I thought I'd throw a couple quick ones at you, and then we'll explore it more in depth with both of you and with the participants today. But a few quick questions jump out, especially because this comes in context of the presidential election and the congressional elections that just took place. And when you talk about the gerontocracy, what we see is that young people, according to polls, and I know that many of the polls were more directional than direct in terms of their efficacy this year, but that in general, younger people overwhelmingly were for Vice President Biden, and elderly people initially appeared to be switching towards Vice President Biden. Some of the after-election effects suggest that some of them stayed home in broader numbers for President Trump at this point. What do you see out of those results? Is it indeed a reflection of the fact that Vice President Biden emphasized more and more progressive responses to climate change and to social justice issues? Or what do you read into that? And on a longer term basis, what does this mean for political alignment in this country?
Yeah, well, I actually think, between the presidential election and the congressional elections, we saw kind of different things happening. We saw some younger candidates win their congressional elections, while the federal government, the executive branch, and the leadership remained quite a bit older. And so I think that just reflects this tension. I think that it's one of the things that President-elect Biden is really going to have to deal with. And I think we see it early on in some of the remarks he's making, is that I think he's very well aware of the tension, and he is trying to keep it from getting worse and growing. Now, whether he'll be able to accomplish that, I don't know. But it's to me, it's a good sign that he seems to be aware of it. He's not unconscious of it. So, but I expect that we've already seen it a bit with COVID, and I expect it will become more explicit with respect to climate change and with healthcare and the ACA debates that are taking place right now. But there are many generational interests that may be seen to be coming into conflict with one another on that score.
Now, when you talked about the changing shape of the pyramid toward more of a rectangle and the intergenerational conflict that is already creating and indeed may accelerate as the years go on, that's an economic argument. Do you think that argument will become one more of, we need to change the proportion that we're spending for social service programs, Social Security, Medicare, as an example, or spend more across the generations and increase public investment in people as opposed to distribute it differently?
I think my fear would be that it's the first. And my hope would be that it's the second. But I think with the federal deficit continuing to increase at a very high rate, I think there'll be a lot of fiscal pressure over the next 10 years exerted to try to reduce expenditures. And with this pressure from Social Security and Medicare, my fear would be the decision would be made to decrease it. And of course, that's every younger person's worst nightmare, is to pay in your whole working life and not get the benefits that you were counting on when you retire. And so I think that will lead to incredible political pressure from those demographics.
One more question before we turn to your colleague, Tom. You make a compelling case on several economic metrics on how this is creating, as you say, potentially the generation gap becoming a gulf. To what degree is this cultural as well? Or do you see, from a cultural perspective, the distinctions blurring a bit between generations?
When you say cultural, do you mean, can you say a little bit more about what you mean?
So one of the things I'm going to want to explore with both of you, but just as a quick example, while the rest of the nation has eventually, at least legislatively, come to this conclusion, there were striking differences in terms of not necessarily political affiliation, but generation in support for same-sex marriage. And that accelerated the debate much faster than many observers thought was possible. The same dynamic may be happening with marijuana legalization as just another example. Those are two cultural issues that are at play at times between generations. And so between those and then many others, in terms of how they see the culture, in terms of how they see society moving, is that as sharp a division as the economic differences you are able to show all of us today?
I certainly don't think it helps, John, unfortunately. I think that they will come together and make the gap even more salient. I think they're not completely disconnected from one another, but yeah, I certainly acknowledge those examples that you gave were good ones about additional cultural features that are increasing the gap.
Well, terrific. And thank you very much for your presentation, for answering the questions. We'll certainly turn back to you along with your colleague, Tom, but let's turn to him next and get his perspective on this issue as a longtime observer of the generation. So Tom McBride, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John. I'm here in what I might call a soft dialectical opposition to Charles, and perhaps a soft dialectical opposition to myself. At the end of my talk, I may end up in pretty much the same depressing place that Charles did, but I hope to at least suggest that there may be some bright spots in the otherwise rather dour portrait that Charles painted. And I might also add that I am here to some extent as a kind of emissary from the gerontocracy that Charles mentioned, as well, as I'm part of the somewhat older generation. So what I want to start off with is to say that 20 years ago, or even 15 years ago, the generation gap was not quite the very sort of desperate and serious thing that it seems to have become in the last 10 or 15 years. The Mindset List project has always been very much situated in the generation gap. I can remember during the early years when we were researching the Mindset List, we talked a good deal to entering and current college students. And one day we were talking with some, and we showed them an old portable record player from the 1950s and early 1960s. And they thought it was really quite an interesting gadget, this old portable phonograph. But they did have one question, which was, if it's portable, how can you jog with it? And we got quite a big kick out of that. We thought that indicated to us that there was a certain droll and at least somewhat comic sort of side to the generation gap. But certainly the Mindset List itself has always been very, very much situated within the generation gap. I was on the Today Show one time, and Lester Holt asked me what the Mindset List meant. And I said it meant that professors should not get hardening of the references. That is to say, students get younger every year, professors get older every year, despite indeed Charles's population rectangle, or maybe because of it. And so as a result, you shouldn't just assume that you can make your old Watergate references and think that the students in front of you will really understand what you mean. So the generation gap has always been alive and well in the Mindset List world. So I want to do two things. Number one, I want to talk about why we have a generation gap in the first place, quite aside from the urgency of the current one. And secondly, I want to talk about the prospects for the closing of that generation gap, by which I do not mean closing it to the extent that young and old come together in a kind of, close encounters of the third kind, kumbaya, or anything approaching that, but circumstances under which the generation gap might close to some extent. And this circumstance primarily concerns the extent to which an existential crisis like COVID or the climate crisis might actually play a role in the narrowing of the generation gap. So let me start off then with 4 reasons why we have a generation gap in the first place, and why, whatever happens to the current generation gap, we're probably going to continue to have something at least of a generation gap in 20 or 30 years. One of the things that I would particularly want to remind the audience is that we have today a terrible generation gap between baby boomers, for example, and Gen Z and millennials. But eventually, Gen Z and millennials will have to conjure with a generation gap that begins with that generation born in 2040 or 2045 or 2050. So what is it that gives the generation gap its sort of, enduring vitality and existence? Well, I think the first one is the market. Clearly, since the 1960s, the market, whether you want to call it global capitalism or neoliberalism or whatever you want to call it, has thoroughly understood the generation gap and has done everything it can to foment it. For example, when I was a kid, there was a revolution in music. It was, Elvis, and it was Sam Cooke, and it was Little Richard, and so forth and so on. And the market and its great, cooperative sibling, technology, understood that these revolutionary tastes in music were beginning to develop, and they came forth with a technology to aid and abet it. And this technology included such things as transistor radios and the aforementioned portable record player, so that kids could get away from their parents and listen to their own music. They didn't have to sit in the living room with the big box phonograph, which was about as big as a toddler, and be forced to listen with their parents to, Perry Como or Frank Sinatra even. But rather they could go off and listen to their own music on their own record player, their own portable record player, and their own portable radio, for example. And technology has since then gone hand in hand with the marketing to the youth economy to create mechanisms by which kids, students, young people could get increasing privacy from their parents. And of course, eventually that led to cable. And that, of course, eventually led further to smartphones and the internet. And so there's going to be a generation gap one way or the other to some extent because of marketing to a youth culture and the technology of privacy that aids and abets it. And that, I think, is the biggest driver of the generation gap today, whatever may happen in the current urgency or emergency. The second thing is something that Charles has already alluded to, and that is advanced medical technology and longevity. There was much less of a generation gap 70 or 80 years ago because when kids were born, they might very well never get to know their grandparents because their grandparents were dead by the time they came of age. This, in effect, of course, was the time of the age and population pyramid as opposed to the rectangle that we have today. And this has all kinds of implications. For one thing, as oldsters live longer, there's a much greater potential for a generation gap as the age gap between young and old increases. One of the things I want to talk about today is climate crisis and its potential for closing the generation gap. But of course, as indeed you have older and older people living longer and longer, you have a greater percentage of the population that is going to discount the climate crisis. Why should I worry about that when, although I'm living longer than ever, I'm probably going to be dead before it really kicks in? Why should I listen to the poster child of the generation gap on climate crisis, Greta Thunberg, who's trying to make me feel guilty because I don't care about the climate crisis? But then in another way, why should I? And then I think there's another more subtle way in which medical technology has aided and abetted the generation gap and the gerontocracy that Charles mentioned. Although older people live longer, that doesn't mean that they feel any better. And they look back on the golden age of their youth as a time when they did feel better. And the more they look back on the golden age, the more younger people look forward, then the more the generation gap becomes very much exacerbated. I'm a person, for example, of a certain age, and I spend a good deal of my time looking back on my life. My daughter and my son, on the other hand, have spent most of their time looking ahead to their lives. I live in the golden age. They live in the uncertain future. And this, of course, naturally creates a generation gap. And this, again, I think is because of the longevity of medical technology, or that medical technology has wrought. And I haven't even said anything here about Social Security, Medicare, which is, of course, another huge part of this. So we certainly all are grateful for Sir Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin, but in another sense, so many problems have resulted from longevity that perhaps Sir Alexander also has, paradoxically and ironically, a lot to answer for. So a third thing is simply hormones. It's a kind of biosocial factor here. And I'm not going to say a whole lot about that other than to say that, of course, when people are younger, they have more energy, they have more testosterone, they have more hormonal energy, and this means that they have certain types of bodies. These bodies will, of course, naturally shape their attitude, their mindset, if you will, even their cultural attitudes. And clearly, this will also create a cultural and generational gap with people who have very different bodies with respect to their relative lack of testosterone. So there's a biosocial, as well, of course, as a technological, medical, longevity, and marketing factor. And then the last one, which I'll mention very quickly because Charles has already covered it extremely well, and that is particularly now the experience of the current younger generation, Gen Z and millennials. We look at books like Steven Pinker's book on how, thanks to the long-term effects of the Enlightenment, things are better than ever. People are living longer. They're feeling better. We don't have, at least until recently, plagues the way we used to, et cetera, et cetera. We can look at all that, and yet the first 20 years, clearly, of the new millennium has not been a whole lot to write home about, pardon me. We have 9/11, we have the Iraqi debacle, we have the Great Recession, we have the cultural polarization, we have the Great Recession, and so forth. And it's quite clear that if you look at the age group between, let's say, 50 and 65, they are very alienated because they do not have something that my father's generation could take for granted, which is a rich and fertile manufacturing economy here at home. And the younger generation does not have something that my generation, when I was young, took for granted, and that is accessible, available, and affordable education, for example. And so, quite clearly, if you look at not only all that's gone wrong with our political life, but if you look at the way the dynamic economy has changed American life and Western European life, and even indeed global life for both the older and the younger generation, you can begin to see that the younger generation has had a very different experience from the one that my generation had, or even Charles's Gen X generation has had. And as Martin Heidegger was fond of reminding us in Being in Time, being is time. They have had a different being because they've grown up in a different time. And that's just going to continue with the dynamic changing culture and economy driven by the internet and changing economic conditions. The generation gap will, like death and taxes, more or less, always be with us as far as the eye can see. But clearly, currently, the current generation has had a very different set of experiences, and they bring those to the table. So those are the big four, I think: the market, longevity, hormones, and radically different experiences. So what I want to do very briefly with the remaining time that I have is to talk about, the potential bright spot in all of this, which is the capacity of existential crises to narrow the generation gap. And I could, very briefly start with COVID. When you had the elated celebration of Vice President Joseph Biden Jr.'s victory, you had young and old in these various festive occasions out on the street, and they were both wearing the same PPE. They were both wearing the same COVID mask. Well, that's a very, very, very slow start, but at least in that brief shining moment, young and old alike had a kind of similar fashion expression. And that gives you a sense of the power, at least, of a global existential crisis to close, in terms of fashion expression, the generation gap. Not a whole lot, but just a little bit. Now, let me give you another example. The existential crisis of the Great Depression of the 1930s. The 1920s was a time of a very, very interesting and exotic generation gap. It was what novelists like F. Scott Fitzgerald actually made their novels about. But then suddenly the world changed on Fitzgerald as a result Great Depression. The generation gap of the 1920s more or less disappeared, and the generation gap essentially sort of vanished. It went into a kind of evanescence because young and old alike were facing the same enemy, namely the global depression, and the same was true of World War II. And then let me give you one more example, which was the Cold War. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days of nuclear potential terror in 1962, young and old alike were facing the prospect of extinction. I don't remember during those 13 days, I was 17 years old, having much of a generation gap to worry about because we were all too worried about being blown up. So let me close quickly then by talking about what is most likely to be the existential closer of the generation gap in coming decades, which is global warming, greenhouse gases, the climate crisis, which I think increasingly becomes something that we simply cannot ignore. And I'll give you sort of, four models by which the climate crisis could, in fact, close the generation gap. The first is an analogous small-town Texas model. When I was a kid, I was sitting in a barber's chair, and the barber who was cutting my hair, a gentleman by the name of Alonzo Stodgel, said, "Well, Tommy, how are you doing?" I think I was about 11, 12 years old. And I said, "Well, Alonzo, I'm not doing too well because I'm worried about being blown up by nuclear weapons." And Mr. Stodgel said, "Well, Tommy, you don't really have to worry about that because the Russians, Khrushchev, doesn't want to die. And if he gets involved in a nuclear holocaust with the United States, he will die. We'll all die. We don't want that to happen. We'll all die. And so as a result, you really don't have to worry about being blown up." Well, of course, I didn't know it at the time, but Mr. Stodgel was actually expressing what the Rand Corporation called the leading Cold War strategy of MAD, mutually assured destruction. We had a common enemy. The common enemy was death. And as a result, ultimately, we sort of put aside the ideological gap to some extent between the Soviet Union and the United States. It really does go to show that a common enemy has a way of concentrating the mind and closing at least certain types of gaps. So if you look at three models that have been already sketched out by three great political philosophers, you could see how this might work with climate crisis. The first is the Thomas Hobbes model. Thomas Hobbes believed that it was fear of one another, fear of all against all, that would cause a compromise so that we savages, we desirous, aggressive human savages, would give over some of our power to a great central authority, which he called the Leviathan. And it would be the Leviathan, in which we gave up some of our authority to this great referee, that would keep life from becoming nasty, brutish, and short. So is it possible that in 20 or 30 years, there might be a global or at least national or international Leviathan, a climate crisis Leviathan, by which we gave up some of the differences between us, including the generation gap, as we face the common enemy of slow global extinction. This becomes, of course, a rather vague possibility, but I think it does indicate through my small town Texas example, as well as my Thomas Hobbes example, that indeed it is at least a kind of fuzzy possibility in which a generation gap becomes, as it were, rather beside the point as we face the common warming of the oceans and the greenhouse gases. A second model would be that of George Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel, who in the 19th century came up with a political model which he called the master-servant dialectic. The master, of course, has all the privileges and the servant has to serve the master, but the master wants the servant to give him some respect. However, the servant will not give the master any respect because he knows that the master really doesn't deserve respect. The master was just born in the lucky sperm club. So, according to Hegel, if indeed the master is going to get respect from the servant, he must give the servant some autonomy, must give the servant some power, must give the servant some freedom. And so, as the master seeks respect, the servant gets more autonomy, and they begin to meet in a kind of synthetic middle. And so, perhaps indeed, as the older generation realizes that the younger generation really does not respect it because of its indifference to the climate crisis, perhaps indeed the older generation will move to seek more respect from the younger generation, give them more autonomy, and there will be a sort of matrix for cooperation again around a common enemy. And finally, last but not least, there is the John Rawls model by which through climate change, the generation gap begins to narrow. John Rawls, in a very famous book called A Theory of Justice in 1971, talked about how if we were all behind a veil and we didn't know whether when we entered beyond this veil, when we entered existence, we were going to be rich or poor or lucky or unlucky or male or female or smart or less smart and so forth and so on. What kind of society would we want? Well, according to Rawls, we want a society that was as equal as possible, as fair as possible, so that the hard edges, the sharp edges of our inequality, which of course we couldn't control since we didn't know how we would be born, the sharp edges would be to some extent blunted and they would be smoothed out. And I think that this does become one model by which facing the common enemy of climate change, a theory of justice might actually narrow the generation gap as well, as indeed the older generation realizes that if it's going to keep any of its wealth at all, it is going to have to cooperate with the younger generation to come together and create a common pool of resources for not only a more climate crisis-free world, but also a more fair and just world in which indeed the generation gap itself becomes, as it were, less and less important and more beside the point. So to summarize, I think that the existential crisis of climate change might indeed narrow the generation gap, but of course, the bad news is that the climate crisis itself might even be a worse crisis, than the generation gap that Charles has outlined. And so on that paradox, I will close my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was quite compelling, and I certainly want to return to several of the themes that you expressed there. I'll quickly turn to Charles for a quick minute and then get back to you and then open it up for questions from the audience as well. But Charles, I'm wondering, with this framing of the climate crisis as a generationally defining event that may narrow these gaps, if you look at some of the economic constructs that you were referencing, do you see this as something that might mean, more economic challenges, less money to spend per generations because of the negative economic effects of climate change? And could that exacerbate, in your view, as you previously expressed, some of the generational conflict?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, John. In fact, I would say, to the extent that I agree with Tom, I would say things are going to get worse before they get better with respect to the generation gap in reference to climate change, particularly because of these economic incentives. And for me, that's the thing about the generational consciousness. It's the incentives, and you have to get the incentives aligned before you can have even an existential crisis bring people together.
Tom, on the climate change issue, you spoke eloquently about how at different stages in one's life, one may be looking back as opposed to looking forward. Could a narrowing of the generation gap happen as the more elderly cohort looks back on life and has a little bit of a different perspective and perhaps shares more of the views of younger people and how they see this versus the generational cohort more in the middle? Do you see any potential for that alignment to happen?
Well, I do see some potential for that, John. I guess the first thing I would want to say is to signal agreement with Charles that I think it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. We often hear that when we are doing over or renovating a house. Well, it looks terrible. Yes. Well, of course, it always gets worse before it gets better. Well, let's hope indeed that it does get better. But it seems to me that as far as the older generation, beginning to take some sort of action in coordination with the younger generation about the climate crisis. One of the enormous obstacles, I think, to that actually happening is that you could certainly get older people to feel that they certainly want to give their own grandchildren a greener earth, a cleaner earth, a more promising earth, and so forth. However, when it comes to thinking about a generation outside their own grandchildren, this becomes, as it were, a somewhat harder leap to make. And so here, I think, is where, we're going to need leadership. We're going to need rhetoric. And yet, I think that leadership and that rhetoric does have, promisingly, some precedent. I think that we have seen in the history of rhetoric in the world that it does become possible for a large mass society to look at a single individual and believe that it shares a kind of cultural kinship with that individual. And so if indeed you did have leadership that more or less was able to, shall we say, talk to an older generation and convince them that their own grandchildren, whom they know well, are simply a metonymy or a token of everybody's grandchildren, then I do think that combined with serious consequences as a result of, rising sea levels and more frequent hurricanes and so forth, might very well indeed create a kind of not only narrowing of the generation gap, but also perhaps some generational cooperation to fight this sort of common existential enemy.
Well, I'm going to, in just a moment, turn it to the audience. We have several questions that are lined up. I'm going to, in terms of transition, ask you one, Charles, about some of the points that your colleague Tom brought up, and he spoke at length about the market and technology. And in particular, when you consider technology, marketers, as we're all well aware, like to show how technology brings us together. Young people communicating with grandma over the internet, and that it's a unifying experience and one that dulls the divisions between generations. Do you see it that way? Of course, not as rose-colored as Apple or Microsoft or other tech giants would want you to see, or do you see technology actually being a driving dynamic between the deepening divisions between age cohorts?
Yeah, well, we even have a word for it, the digital divide. And in my experience, working with different generations, working with my parents, and then working with my son, you've got sort of 3 tiers of digital nativity, nativeness. And the technology, in my experience, has led to more division than it has to, bringing together. But I don't take my experience to be, universal on that. I certainly understand the argument that we can actually Zoom, we can FaceTime, we can do all of these things to actually see one another. Though I think that we kind of get caught up in our own generational patterns for doing those things, so that the divide seems more prevalent.
And a very quick follow-on on that, do you see the divisions regarding technology more related to how native one is? Younger people, of course, came of age with the internet as one of the markers on your list has been, versus their parents and of course their grandparents, or what people do on it and what they access and what they prioritize. And you think about the extraordinary market power and cultural importance of video games as an example to younger people, which is something that there is a real sharp generational divide, of those who did not grow up with that and certainly don't seem to understand the cultural alacrity that so many young people have towards, gaming in that respect. Is it more the technology itself or the application of it?
My view is it's the technology itself. And, just one observation that I would make about that is I have noted that older people I see interacting with technology are scared of it. They're scared of making a mistake, doing something wrong. And sadly, I find myself falling into this camp more and more every day. As opposed to, watching people of my son's generation, is they're trying things out. They're testing the limits of its capability. So I am wary, and, people senior to me are wary of the technology, just the literal hardware of it for fear of making a mistake. And my son's generation is much more risk-taking with it, creative, using it as a tool. And so that leads me to focus on this hardware part of it more than the sort of software or what you can accomplish with it.
Well, speaking of these transformative technologies, we certainly have Zoom, and we have questions that are lined up with that. So we're going to get to some of those right now, and I'm going to turn to my colleague Kirsten, who's going to share some of those.
Yes, we'll start with a question from an audience member named Sherry, who says, can you say more about why the younger generation does not have the same accessible, affordable opportunities for education?
I can try. Charles probably has a better answer than I do because he's a social scientist. Well, let me just begin answering that question by saying that, as an emissary from the gerontocracy on this panel, I can remember when one could attend the University of Texas, Austin for $75 a semester. That was the total tuition, $75 a semester, or $150 a year. It's very, very clear that the costs of higher education have gone up drastically since then. It's not entirely clear why. One theory is that higher education really doesn't know how to drive costs down, that you can make a cheaper pizza, but it's kind of hard to make a cheaper educational product or process. And so as a result, the cost of higher education has gone up. I think another is that in the various states, because governors and legislatures have not wanted to raise taxes, that has meant that state universities have had less public subsidies from the state. They've had to raise tuition and so forth and so on. And then, of course, it's very, very clear that globalization, the displacement of globalization, the deindustrialization of America has created some real hardships for those particularly who come from blue-collar families. I came from a blue-collar family, but my father lived in the golden age of manufacturing, and so I actually had no difficulty meeting tuition costs. And all of that has come together to create an affordability gap, an accessibility gap. And as a result, higher education has become more and more dear, and yet it's become more and more essential. If you don't have some kind of at least BA or BS degree today, you're really just sort of cooked in this economy. So it's become more and more dear, and yet more and more necessary at the same time. Some years ago, another one of our partners, Ron Neef, and I were at North Texas State University, where there was a large cohort of Latino students, and we talked to a lot of those, and they said, well, we're not on the 4-year plan, we're on the 6-year plan, because we often have to drop out and get jobs in order to make money, to come back in. So it's an extremely distressing situation. It's part of the reason that I think today's millennials and Gen Z don't like baby boomers like me. As my daughter said to me once, she is a millennial. She said, well, Dad, congratulations. Capitalism worked very well for you. Hasn't worked so well for me. And I think that, the problem of the cost of higher education is a big, big, big chunk of this. And one of the reasons that millennials and Gen Z have been so much followers of Elizabeth Warren and Senator Sanders is because they have really promised some redress of this huge inequality of economic resources between boomers and the younger generation.
Quickly on this, Charles, is this a manifestation of some of the economic differences between generations, the overinvestment or the overspending, as some perceive it, of the older cohort versus the younger cohort?
Oh, I think for sure. Well, first, let me just say, Tom sounded an awful lot like a social scientist, didn't he? But secondly, let me say yes. I think that that the economic position is the driver of a lot of that, relative to how difficult it is to get an education. I mean, Tom didn't even talk about debt, which he certainly could have. He talked about the costs, but you can ask almost any college graduate, and they know that is a major issue that they're going to be dealing with for the very foreseeable future.
Let's get to another question from our participants, please.
Yes, Maggie is wondering, would you say that the increasing privacy with children from parents has led to more individuality in children and therefore the gap? Would you consider children that act as individuals and seek information on their own are contributing to this gap?
Well, once again, I'll jump in first. I think the broad answer to that question is yes. And I think that what we have seen over the last 40 or 50 years and over the last 15 or 20 years, sort of on steroids, is a shift from the authority that kids dealt with 40 or 50 years ago, which was a much more vertical authority, which the greatest influence on children were their parents. And now it is much more horizontal influence and authority, in which the greatest influence is now peer influence rather than parental influence, which does not mean that parental influence has gone away, but it is simply not as powerful as it used to be. And so I don't see it as much as parents saying to their children today, Gen Z, et cetera, Gen Y, go out and be an individual, as much as it is just something that happens as they, get into their own privacy, they get into their own Zoom, they get into their own Skype, they get into their own social media and so forth. Peer influences are much, much, much more important. And so as a result, I think you not only just have individualism in the current generation, but you also have a lot of decentralization of different cohorts and cliques in the current generation.
Yeah, and I would just say that I think that technology really plays a strong role in that process that Tom is talking about as well.
So it fosters this, it accelerates this dynamic. Let's get to another question, please.
Yes, I'm going to combine two questions, one from an anonymous attendee and one from a Beloit alum who says hello. And the anonymous attendee says, do you think that media echo chambers have amplified the generational divide, combining media outlets with social media to isolate generations? And then there's a similar question about how does a belief in fact or truth, or the belief in the sources that provide those facts or truth, factor into widening or narrowing the gap?
Well, can I answer the first part first? I like, to me, the just the sort of increased, I mentioned the okay boomer line, like I get such a kick out of that. And that it I think the media gloms on to those things. And this whole gerontocracy thing, when I first started, I debated about whether to put that in my remarks because it's becoming so widespread. I mean, you turn on NPR, or you look in the newspaper, everybody's concerned about the gerontocracy, which can't help but fuel those divisions, to my way of thinking. But then, it's how do you have this harder edged notion of what, truth or what we should actually expect, or, people making predictions and testing them with data rather than just coming up with whatever's off the top of their head. So I mean, that's to connect the two that way is, I think, yes, definitely the media echo chamber contributes to the growing of the generation gap, but I also think it can make it hard to get really sound demographic analysis about the generation gap, if that makes sense.
Indeed it does. And before we get to Tom, I'm just going to ask you a quick question about the gerontocracy that you've referenced. And in some societies, certainly there's at least a stronger connection between age and wisdom. Do you sense that the rising concern over the gerontocracy is simply that so many of our leaders are of a certain age, and that these concerns would be reduced if it was perceived, bipartisan basis, that indeed their age and experience was a great asset to this country. What is it that's driving the concern about this?
Mhm. I think it's the concern about interests. And that so if there was more diversity in age, I think it would be okay. I think people certainly do accept the with age comes wisdom, but then on the other hand, I had a friend who told me the other day they were talking to their parents or something, and then I talked to them shortly after and said, hey, I was going to do this panel with you all today. They said, I love my mom, but I don't want her to be president. you know and I thought that was really interesting. Like, how do you do the honoring of the elders while at the same time recognize the interests or potential blind spots that might exist.
Any thoughts on this, Tom?
What was the other question from the Beloit alum? Could you repeat that again?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me? Yes. That was, how does a belief in fact or truth, or the sources of that fact or truth, factor into widening or narrowing the gap?
How does what again? I'm sorry.
A belief in a particular fact or truth, or a belief in the sources promoting that fact or truth?
Well, I think that it's very clear that the whole gerontocracy thing has become a very successful meme. Clearly, one of the aspects of digital technology that we've gotten used to is what Richard Dawkins called viruses of the mind. It's kind of interesting. We're on Zoom in the age of COVID, which is another virus, but the meme of the gerontocracy is to some extent a kind of virus of the mind, but it's obviously catching on a great deal. But I think that we should perhaps examine why we have a gerontocracy to the extent that we do, and of course, as far as the idea that the gerontocracy represents wisdom, well, I don't know how easy it is to credit Mitch McConnell or President Trump as sort of founts of wisdom. That'll be my one political comment. But I think there are a couple of reasons why we have the gerontocracy. First of all is what I mentioned earlier, which is that people are living longer. If you look, for example, at the average age at which presidents died before 1945, as opposed to post 1945, you'll find an enormous difference. So, one of the reasons we have a gerontocracy is because when Mitch McConnell gets a very, 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 very bad bacterial infection, there's an antibiotic for him. And the same would be true of Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi. So I think that's one reason. But I think there's a second reason, and that is because the younger generation, which resents the gerontocracy, is not as reliable a voting cohort as the older generation is. Those between 50 and about 70 are extremely reliable voters. There's almost 100% efficiency in their turnout. They're very invested. It's really rather paradoxical because you would think, given that they're going to die soon, they would have less investment in the future of the country. But no, it seems as though they have a tremendous amount of investment in the future of the country. Why that is, I'm not really sure. Maybe they think they're already going to live forever. I'm not really sure. But, clearly, one of the reasons you have the gerontocracy is because the gerontocracy supporters vote. And young people, until recently, were simply not as reliable.
We're going to get to some more questions via Zoom. If there are any in the room, please let me know and we'll field those as well. But why don't we turn to another one, please?
One of our Anonymous attendee is mentioning that none of the discussion has even mentioned Gen X, and the discussion has lumped together Gen Z and millennials. What is the impact of the generation gap between these three generations?
That seems to be a common refrain in all of these discussions, that a lot of times Gen X, for multiple reasons perhaps, including they're a smaller cohort than the baby boomers and millennials, don't get overly discussed. So, Charles, why don't you address that question, please?
Yeah, well, I mean, my answer is about resources and the relative access to resources. I suspect, that some portions of Gen X are going to fall closer into alignment with, baby boom and older cohorts, while others are going to go in the other direction. But I think it has a lot to do with your access to resources. It'll be very interesting to see, going forward, because, as Tom pointed out in some of the things that he said, the baby boomers were such a important cohort, but then, the millennials are essentially the baby boom echo. And so it won't be very long in the grand scheme before the boomers are out, and and Gen X and the pyramid starts de-rectangularizing, or triangularizing, I guess I should say. And so that's what I focus on with respect to some of the younger cohorts, is what's going to happen when Gen X becomes, that, top of the pyramid cohort. And I think that there will be some radical changes from this process that I've been describing today, once that really starts taking place.
Let's turn to another question so we can get to a few more before the end of our time here, please.
Yes, another anonymous attendee would like to hear your thoughts on how race has played into this gerontocracy. African Americans and people of color did not benefit from the past institutions in the same way. Are older African Americans as divided compared to the younger generation, or are people of color staying together more than the other groups?
Terrific question. Whoever would like to jump in and field that, if you have research or thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it.
Well, one of the surprises so far, at least in the aftermath of polling in the 2020 presidential election, is that President Trump did somewhat better among younger African-American voters. He did even better among younger Latino voters, but he also did better than Joe Biden did, as opposed to Hillary Clinton, among younger African-American voters. They came out in greater numbers for Clinton than they did for Biden, and in greater numbers for Trump in 2020 than they did for Trump in 2016. And this, I think, is clearly going to be the object of a great deal of study as we come to look at a generational divide, within particular ethnic groups such as Latinos and African Americans. And this is further complicated by the fact that today's generational divide between younger and older in general is a generational divide between baby boomers and to some extent Gen X, who are primarily Caucasian, and a younger generation that is about 50% non-Caucasian. So you have these two things going on. You have intra-ethnic generation gaps, and then you have generational gaps that are age-related, and these age-related generation gaps are very much generation gaps between mostly white oldsters and a significantly multicultural set of of youngsters. And it's going to be fascinating. And I'm sure that, many a doctoral dissertation in sociology, social psychology, et cetera, is going to be revolving around exploring some of these issues.
Yeah, I would say too, if we go back to, Mannheim's definition of what this generational consciousness was, but we can think of any kind of consciousness. I think racial consciousness, ethnic consciousness, religious consciousness. When you, realize that you're part of a group and you have interests within that group, that is the thing that's going to bring the gap or the conflict. And so, from the work that I have seen on the subject, I think that there is less generation gap in marginalized communities, but I think it's still quite present. And Tom has given some examples of things that he saw from the election and so forth. But I think that it's less significant because of the multiple sets of interests, the multiple identities that people are balancing. And that's echoing what Tom said as well. As that's one of the problems with whiteness, is that it's taken as the baseline, and when that happens, then you're not paying attention to these intra age or intra race or gender distinctions.
Let's take at least one more audience question via Zoom, and then I'll finish it up with another question and then finish by 5 here. So please.
All right, I think the last audience question we'll take is from Jackson Benning. He asks, is COVID really an equalizer that can close the generation gap? To me, it seems like the data is showing that older people are more at risk for worse symptoms from COVID than younger people are, and this might lead younger people to be a bit more careless in this time than older people, speaking from the perspective of someone living on a college campus.
Particularly with Thanksgiving coming up and people gathering as families here, what do you see in this question? It's a great question.
Well, I guess I should say that what may be obvious from my remarks and Charles's remarks is that I don't think COVID has the potential of the climate crisis for closing the generation gap and pooling common resources against a common enemy. It's fairly obvious to me, at least, that COVID is not as big an existential crisis. It's not enough of an existential crisis to have that kind of effect. Sometimes I think that whenever we want to find some kind of deeper philosophical wisdom, we have a tendency to go back to 1950 sci-fi movies. Was kind of a golden age of Hollywood sci-fi movies. One of them was The Day the Earth Stood Still, where an alien comes to Earth and tells all Earthlings, forget about your gaps between young and old and communism and capitalism, because if you Earthlings don't get together, we aliens from another planet are going to kill you all. So it's like, love one another or die. That's essentially what this alien says. Well, I don't think COVID has that kind of love one another or die existential threat. And because it has not, I think that in some ways, while COVID may have created a situation in which young and old make the same fashion statement with COVID masks, it has otherwise, I think, actually only illustrated the generation gap, because, of course, younger people have a greater chance of being asymptomatic. They have a greater chance of not getting very sick. They have a greater chance of not having the kind of pre-existing conditions for which COVID is very dangerous. So I don't think COVID quite does it. It's not quite up there with the Great Depression or the Cold War or the coming theoretically, speculatively, climate change crisis.
Charles, your view in particular in comparison with the Great Depression, the climate crisis, and other defining events.
Can you say that again, John?
What's your view of COVID relative to some of these other defining events?
Yeah, I'm thinking, and I hope that I'm right about this, is that that I agree with Tom and that it doesn't rise to that same level. It just feels like it's been about almost a year now, so it feels just much larger than I will remember it. Yeah, I agree with Tom that I do not think it rises to that level at this point. And I actually see COVID exacerbating the generation gap more than it holds any promise of narrowing it.
Well, I'm going to end on a combination question and ask for brief answers, if you will, but both of you have been doing this for years, either beginning this or accelerating this project, which really has become nationally known and really resonant across generations. One of the things that actually brings people together here. As you look at your experience in this, two-part question. Are we in a more rapid generational shift, or what people are experiencing now who are going to be freshmen in college, which is the metric that has always defined the list? Have the changes been more rapid than other generations? And of all the years you look at this, what's the biggest change that you see?
Well, I think the short answer to your question, John, is yes. There's, I mean, I think that, in the early years of the mindset list, we were very much struck with how rapidly culture was changing. And, we began to every year see that every new entering first year of class had less and less knowledge of the Cold War, had less and less appreciation of the Cold War. And then as time went on, we began to see more the gap between digital natives and digital immigrants and so forth and so on. But a lot of that was rather droll and funny. The mindset list itself was in many ways a kind of comic list. As far as how you narrow the generation gap, our advice was, get out the mindset list and get a bunch of old people in the room, get a bunch of young people in the room, and have them go through the list and talk about what it was like when, you were growing up in '08, as opposed to, what it's like to grow up in 2008 or whatever. But I think that it's not just a rapid cultural change now that is driving the generation gap. It is, I think, the great economic divide. And I think just as, Trump voters have been displaced by globalization, so have younger voters been displaced by globalization. And I think that, you've got the winners in globalization, those who have advanced degrees, those who can deal with the information economy, et cetera. They're the winners. And then there are those who don't have advanced degrees or only have high school degrees, who don't have much leverage in the economy. Well, that's one set of winners and losers. But there's another set of winners and losers, and those are the winners at the end of the age spectrum, particularly boomers and silents, and to some extent, early Gen X's, and this current generation of young people. And I think that kind of sense that younger people have, that they've been screwed over by the market and government hasn't helped any, and that the people who are in charge are a bunch of old people who don't even get it, including Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi. I think this is just going to sharpen the generation gap for the time being. It's going to get worse, I think, before it gets better.
Thank you very much, Tom. And we'll finish with you, Charles. Some brief thoughts on this, please.
Yeah, well, the X factor here for me is technology. I mean, that's one of the things that stunned me in working on the mindset list is how rapidly technology has evolved. And, whether it's in the healthcare industry or communication or, weapons and military or, it's the list over the years just zeroes in on various examples in these far-flung areas. But I'm really intrigued with how technology, influences or drives the cultural questions. And that's something that's really struck me is how fast can technology keep going? Is this pace that we've seen over the last 15 to 20 years everyone tells me that it's going to continue like this unabated, but I'm not too sure about that.
And I think in the absence of some kind of existential common enemy, I think this technology is going to open up further generational divides as Gen Z and the millennials age. I can't imagine what that is, but I mean, I can imagine, when today's millennials and Gen Z are, grandparents, the grandparent millennials and Gen Z are going to look at their grandchildren. They're going to say, when I was in college, I actually had to read. I couldn't just watch videos all day.
Mhm.
So, I mean, where's it going to end? I just think that the mind cannot fathom, as Charles says, just how much rapid technological change is going to widen the generation gap. Of course, some scholars actually think we're in the beginning of a post-human age. And, by 2100 or 2150, we're going to have fewer and fewer Homo sapiens and more androids. So on that note.
On that note, indeed, we're going to have to end it today. And you're quite right that the technological change has been extraordinary on every level: social, political, economic, cultural. But it's also been wonderful in many ways, including this Zoom opportunity here. So thank you very much for being available today. And thank you very much for joining me today, either on campus or online. This has been the third part in our 6-part series on polarization and identities. We'll pick up again after the turn of the year. Thanks again for taking the time for your terrific questions. Have good and safe holidays, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.